Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm Dkohn with Dkohn Designs. I'm so glad you stopped by today. It's week 2 of the free Ukraine Always Quilt Along. In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to construct the traditional rolling stone block. Before we get started on the block, I want to invite you to join my Quilt Along. It's free to participate, but I hope that you will consider donating $12 to the charity of your choice that is assisting Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees during this terrible time of war and crisis. In this video, I'll show you many tips and tricks and techniques to construct your rolling stone block quickly and easily. Please stay tuned toward the end of the video when I'll reveal the quilt layout for the entire quilt for both blocks 1 and 2. I will show the quilt diagram on the screen. You will be able to download the free Block 2 pattern and the quilt diagram in this week's PDF on my blog. Go to dkohndesigns.com, go to the free patterns tab. That's where you can download this week's free Block 2 pattern. If you missed week 1 or the quilt along overview, you can again go to my blog at dkohndesigns.com to the free patterns tab and download the free quilt along overview PDF and the free Block 1 pattern, the Ukrainian flag. If you missed last week's YouTube video, I'll have the link to that at the end of this video. Just click on the picture and it'll take you right to the video. I'll also have a playlist of all of the videos for the free Ukraine Always Quilt Along. On my makeshift design wall behind me, you can see last week's block, the Ukrainian flag block, and this week's block, the Rolling Stone quilt block. I'm so excited to show you how to construct the Rolling Stone block. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and tell a friend. Please leave me a comment and let me know that you're participating in the quilt along. I'd love to hear from you. Also, head on over to my blog at dkohndesigns.com and subscribe to my email list. That way you'll be notified whenever I post on my website. Don't forget to click the notifications bell on YouTube as well, so you'll be notified whenever I post a new video. The week 3 video, the final video for this quilt along, will be next Sunday, March 27th. That will include the reveal of the final quilt and some tips and tricks for setting and finishing your quilt. Please join me again next week as well. As you can see, for week 2, we are doing the traditional rolling stone quilt block. Here's how the pieces fit together. Fabric B will be your center block. It will be the 4 corners, B, 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 and B. Fabric C will be part of the strip set here. Fabric F will be part of the strip set here. These strip sets will be at the top, the bottom, and each side. In today's video, we will be sewing together our fabric C and fabric F to make strip sets and then cutting them down to the required squares. The last fabric you'll see on here is the fabric E. There are 4 for every B square. So 4 here, 4 here, and 4 here. After we cut our strip sets with fabric C and fabric F, then we will begin putting together our fabric B and fabric E with a stitch and flip method to make this into a diamond shape. Before we begin assembling the strip sets, let me go over a few tools that might be helpful for this block. Here I have some tools that will be helpful when sewing this block. First, you'll need a ruler that's at least 12.5 inches long. Mine is 15, that works, and at least 4.5 or 5 inches wide. So this is a 5 by 15 ruler. That'll be perfect for my needs. Of course, you'll need a rotary cutter, and if you have them, snips are easier to use, in my opinion, than scissors. In addition, what might be helpful is diagonal seam tape by Cluck Cluck Sew. If you have it, you can use that to guide your 1/4 inch seams. Of course, you could use a 1/4 inch foot or a sewing tape ledge, whatever works for you. Another thing that might be helpful is some sort of tape. I use some Scotch brand removable tape, which I really like. You could use masking tape, you could use washi tape. That will be for marking your ruler. If you don't have a square ruler for this project, you can mark your ruler to the size that you need. I'll go into that in more detail later in the video. If you want to know more about these tools and other tools I recommend, I'm going to leave a link in the video description and at the end of the video of my video 10 quilting tools I love and recommend. A couple other things that, if you have them, would be really nice to have but are not necessary. One is a 12.5 by 12.5 inch square ruler. I happen to have one. because that was the first block that I started with when I made my very first quilt, was sewing a plain patchwork of 12-inch squares. If you have this, this will make it quick and easy to trim all 25 blocks, but again, you don't have to have it, you can use your mat. The next one that would be helpful is this smaller 4.5 by 4.5 inch ruler. Let me turn it this way. This happens to be an Omni Grade 4.5 by 4.5 inch ruler. That will help you in trimming up your individual pieces in this block, because all of the pieces of the Rolling Stone block are 4.5 by 4.5 inches square, and that will really help keep things straight and accurate for you. If you don't have it, that's fine. We're going to use this instead, taped off, to square up the blocks. So if you don't have this, it's okay. We'll do this method. The last thing I want to touch on before we get started with sewing up the block is have a look at the amount of fabric that's left. In the cutting instructions, I said that you needed 2 3/4 yards of the blue and 2 3/4 yards of the yellow. You probably have close to a 1/4 yard left over, but I didn't want to make it so that if you made a mistake, your quilt was ruined because you didn't have enough fabric. A quick note about the scraps that you might have left over from this quilt along. You might want to consider joining another quilt along. This one is hosted by Bonnie Hunter of Quiltville.com. She's hosting the Hearts for Hope Sew Along. It is a quilt that uses string piece blocks with foundation paper. It's a great way to use up your leftover blue and yellow scraps. She is offering a free sew along in conjunction with Gudrun Erla of GE Designs as a fundraiser for helping Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. Her sew along is different from mine because it uses string pieced blocks and foundation paper piecing. So this would be a perfect way to use up your scraps. It doesn't matter the width of your scraps. It can be skinny like this or wider like this. It's all good. And she shows you exactly how to do it. You can make as few or as many blocks as you want and add on a table run. You could make a table runner, a quilt, a pillow, anything you want to show your support for Ukraine and use up your scraps. I'll leave a link to the website and the sew-along information in the video description. In week 1, we cut the fabrics for all of the pieces for block 2. I won't be showing that again this week, but I do want to show you the stacks of them so you see the volume that you'll have for each fabric. This is fabric B. You'll have 100 squares total, 4.5 by 4.5 in the yellow. I recommend that you separate them in groups of 4, 4, 4, all the way, so you have 20 sets of 4, and then the remaining 20 squares you'll keep separate. Those will be the center for each block, and you'll just set those aside for now. The reason I chose to stack my fabric B squares in groups of 4 is because there are 4 needed for the corners of every block. That way, if I only have a few minutes to sew, I can chain piece 4 at a time and get 1 block done at a time in a minimal amount of time. The first thing that we're going to do with the Rolling Stone block is to sew our strip sets together for the middle section at the top, the sides, and the bottom. I'll need a fabric C rectangle, a strip, 2.5 inch strip, and a fabric F rectangle, a 2.5 inch strip. If you cut yours in 36 inch strips, that's perfectly fine. I cut mine in 18 inch because 18 inches is what you need. When you cut that down into 4.5 inch squares, that's what you'll need for the equivalent of 1 Rolling Stone block. We're going to sew right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam all the way along the length of the strip. Once we do that, we'll press it to the dark side and then subcut the strip down into 4.5 inch squares. I'm sewing my strip set together, fabric C and fabric F, right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Next, we're going to press the seam to the dark side, and then we will subcut into 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch squares. I've laid my strip on my wool mat. You don't need one. You can use a regular ironing board, but I find this is working well for me. First, I'm going to set my seam by pressing down on the seam to help the fibers relax. A quick tip when you're trying to press to the dark side, put the dark fabric on the top. Then when you roll it back, it'll automatically go to the dark side. I'm using the nose of the iron to press, and there you are. The seam is pressed to the dark side, this way. Okay, now we're going to subcut it into 4.5-inch squares. Here I have 2 strip sets. I'm going to show you how to subcut them quickly rather than just one at a time. The first thing I'm going to do with my strip sets is check to make sure that they're straight. In this case, they're just a tiny bit off, so I'm just going to make sure they're exactly straight. That'll ensure the accuracy of my blocks. I'm lining up the edge here with my mat and then along the line right there, and trimming ever so slightly. I know it's not much, but it does help with the accuracy of your blocks because you're going to be subcutting using this as your reference line. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the strips not on top of each other, because then you'll have a bump that'll be hard for the rotary cutter to go through. So you want to stack them so they're next to each other. Like this is fine as long as they're exactly even. And then line up the top one with your mat and the bottom with the mat as well. Now I'm going to use my mat and my ruler to measure over 4.5 inches and then subcut the strips. 1, 2, 3, 4.5. Should be right here. And then you can check the last one just to make sure it's 4.5. Check to make sure they're 4.5. I'm going to trim this one ever so slightly because it's not exact. Now we have fabric C and F strip sets. You'll need 4 for each block. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's for one block, and I've cut enough for a second block since I cut both strip sets at the same time. Here's how they fit into the block. You can see the strip sets are here, 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 and here. Let's move on to making our corner blocks. This would be with fabric B and our fabric E squares. The first thing you'll need to do is to take your fabric E squares and mark a diagonal line corner to corner. To speed this up, I do 2 or sometimes even 4 at a time. I've lined the diagonal corners on a line on my mat, making sure they're exact. I line my ruler up and I account for the width of the pencil, and then I draw my diagonal line. For me, the pencil shows up fine on the back of this. You may need to use a chalk pencil in white or a light color if it doesn't show on the back of your blue fabric. There's mine. I'll need to do 2 more so that I have a total of 4 E squares for one fabric B square. You could, of course, do these one at a time. That would be something you could definitely do while you're watching TV or listening to a podcast. I will show you an alternate way where you don't need to draw the diagonal line. You would use diagonal seam tape, which is this, instead, if you feel comfortable with it. But otherwise, drawing the diagonal line is definitely the way to go. Here I have my fabric B square, and I have my 4 fabric E squares. What we're going to do is take one fabric E square, turn it so that the diagonal line is across the corner, not with the corner. So it wouldn't be like this, not with the corner, but across the corner, lining up the fabric E square right sides together. You may want to pin so it doesn't twist when you're carrying it to the machine, so it stays in place. You're going to stitch just barely to the outside of the diagonal line. So not the inside toward the block, but toward the outside. The reason is you have to count for the fold over. What we're going to do is stitch and then fold this over on the seam, and you want to make sure that this part of the triangle goes at least to the edge of the fabric B beneath it. If it doesn't, then your fabric's going to be, then your square is not going to be square, it'll be lopsided. So you need to make sure that you sew just to the outside of the fold, maybe a thread's width, so that when you fold this over, it has enough clearance to make sure it goes clear to the edge of the fabric B square. And then you'll do the same thing down here on this one. Do the opposite corners. You can do 2 at a time. Do opposite corners. Pin it in place. Let me show you another way to sew on your fabric E squares without drawing diagonal lines. On my sewing machine, I have diagonal seam tape. This is from Cluck Cluck Sew, which you can get online. You would take the wrong side, so this is the wrong side of my fabric E, lay it on the fabric B square, right sides together, get it right in the corner, right up on the corner so they're exactly matching, and then you turn it, you're going to sew across this way. What you do is you line up the corner point with just to the outside of the red line right there, and then you line up this one right here, just barely touching the red line. You don't want it in the middle of the line because we need to allow for the fold over the stitched seam. So I'm going to lay it down and scoot it right up on in there, and then make sure this is even and just barely like that. As the machine pulls it, I'm going to make sure this point is just touching the red line. Then I'll repeat on the other side. Again, laying it right sides together in the corner, lining it up. And then from here, it's exactly the same. We're going to press them open, make sure they fit, then trim off the excess on both of them and repeat on the other corners. So if you use the diagonal seam tape, you won't need to draw the lines. Okay, I'm at the machine and I want to stitch on the outside of this line, so to the outside of the block, just barely a thread's width. Before I flip it around, you'll see it's just past that line, so that when I fold it over, I'll make sure that it meets the edge of the B square. Let's do the other side. I just flip it around and I sew down the diagonal again. Again, sewing just to the outside of the line. And there you go. Now, before you trim off this excess, you want to iron it over. I recommend ironing it over first, just to make sure that it clears the edge. Because if it doesn't, then you can just quickly rip this seam and restitch and it will be easy. Better to do it first than cut it off and have to finagle with it. It'll be a lot easier to work with the whole piece. Okay, let's press it back and then trim. And then we'll repeat on the other corners. Okay, here we are. We've got 2 of our fabric E squares sewn onto our fabric B. I'm just giving it a quick press to flatten the seam. Now I'm going to fold it over and press to make sure that it goes beyond my B square, which it does. I can see that it does. And I'm going to do the same on this side, just double checking. And again, this one goes right out past it. Now I'm going to trim. For that, I'm going to use my shears. You can see I've repeated the process of sewing on the fabric E squares on the other 2 corners, trimmed it off, and pressed it. Now it's time to square up the block. There are a couple of ways to do it. One is to just use any ruler that's at least about 5.5 inches wide, if you have it. Then take a piece of masking tape or washi tape, and then mark it at 4.5 inches. That way you don't have to look for it every single time, because you're going to be trimming a lot of blocks. So then I line it up so that the fabric is on the edge, here and here. And then I trim the top, holding firmly, the top and the sides holding firmly. And on the other side as well, rotate it around, do the same thing. Holding firmly the side and the top. And there you have it. That's one way to do it. Another way would be to position the block within the 4.5 inch mark. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4.5, 1, 2, 3, 4.5 this way, and then this way as well. So put the block so it's centered, and then use your ruler to cut off any excess all the way around. The last way to square up a 4.5 inch block is to use a 4.5 by 4.5 inch ruler, which is what I have here. So you can line it up on the diagonal so that the corner meets here and here, and then trim like that. You would trim this way, and then you would rotate your block and then line it up again, the diagonal corner and diagonal corner of your block, and then trim again on the other sides. That's another way to trim your 4.5 inch blocks. Now we'll have to repeat this process with our fabric B square and our 4 fabric E squares and make 3 more of these blocks for a total of 4 blocks, which will form the corners of our rolling stone block. All right, now that we've sewn the pieces, let's assemble our block. First, we'll want the center square. Then we'll want our top, bottom, and sides. We want the blue part of the strip set to face toward the center. That way it will highlight the center. So sides, bottom, and top, like that. Making sure you can see. There we go. Screw it up just a hair. And then we want our corner pieces. Let's turn it this way so it doesn't mess around. Now that we've assembled the block, it's time to sew it together. You have two choices here. You can either sew them across in rows, or you can sew them down in columns and like this. It's totally up to you. I typically sew across in rows because that's how my brain works, but it's totally up to you, whatever you want to do. So to sew in rows, we're going to do it like this. You want to make sure you don't get the blocks flipped, so carefully put them together. You can pin. I probably won't, but you can definitely pin. The center and the bottom row, and take those to the machine. Then you'll add the third block on the end of each row. One way to help ensure that you keep the rows or columns straight is to put your pieces on a design board like I have here. This is just a quick and easy homemade one, some batting on foam board and a little duct tape, but you can buy them online as well or make your own. That way they won't fall off easily when I'm transporting them, and I can refer to them easily when I'm stitching the block together. Okay, you can see I'm at the machine. I've got my design board with my pieces, and I've got the first top section of the first row ready to sew. I've chain pieced the first blocks of all three rows. I'm going to add the third block. Here you can see the point was not cut off. It turned out great. As you can see, we've sewn the three rows for our block. Before you sew them together, you'll want to check and see if you need to trim any of them. You can see on this one, my middle section is a little bit long, so I'm going to trim it off. This one looks good. This one needs just a bit of a trim. Once we do that, we're going to press. When we press the seams for the block, you'll want to press the top row seams going to the right, the middle row to the left, and the bottom row to the right. That way, when you sew the rows together, the seams will nest at the intersection points and make it easy for the block to be sewn accurately. Because the top and the bottom rows of the block will be pressed in the same direction, I'm going to do them at the same time. First, I set my seams. This one and this one. Then I'm going to press them back. And then I check the back to see if it needs any help. It looks pretty good, just one tiny spot. And then the other one. And again, I'm trimming the sections to make sure that they are even before I sew the rows together. Then I'm doing the middle section, same thing. Set my seam. And this time I'm pressing toward the left. So I'm going to go this direction, like that. And I check the back side to make sure they're all set. This one is pressed the wrong direction, so I'm going to fix it. The center section should be pressed toward the dark side. I saw a quick pressing mistake and I fixed it. There we go. I'll give the 3 rows a quick trim and we're ready to assemble the final block. Before I sew the block together, I put the rows on my design board to make sure I've got them laid out correctly. That saves me frustration later. Ask me how I know. Okay, so we're going to sew rows 1 and 2 together. What I like to do then is to pin at the intersections, making sure that my seams nest. You can see here that I've chosen to pin not only at the seams where they nest, but at the beginning and then at the points where the diamond crosses the seam as well, pinning about 2 pins per section, 2 pins per block. That helps it stay straight and accurate while I stitch. Again, right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam. There are rows 1 and 2. Now let's add the 3rd row. Again, I'm going to nest the seams and pin. All right, here is our finished quilt block. All we need to do is press it. What I want to point out is I'm going to have you press the opposite of what I've traditionally seen for the block. I can see that the seams want to go this way toward the center. That helps with laying down at the corners like that, so that's how we're going to do it. I'm going to pull it this way so you can see. Again, I'm pressing the seams toward the center of the block. Like that. Even though there's a little bit, even though the seam here may show through on the other side, the block will lay more flat. If you have any that are not wanting to cooperate, just give them another quick press. And let's flip it over and see if we need to press anything. Just a little bit right there. Press out any tiny puckers. And it's ready to square up to 12.5 by 12.5. You can do yours right after you finish each block, or what I'm going to do is square up all my blocks at once at the end, once I have all 25 blocks done. We've already made 5 of the Ukrainian flag, and now we're working on our 20 rolling stone blocks. And here's our first one. Next, I'll come back with the layout for the quilt. I won't have the full quilt to show you in this video. That I'll save for the 3rd week, the final video next week. Here is the diagram for the Ukraine Always quilt. As you can see, the Ukrainian flag appears in each row. In row 1, it's block 1. In row 2, it's block 2. In row 3, it's block 3. In row 4, it's block 4. And row 5, it's block 5. All of the other blocks in each row are the rolling stone block. I'll be back next week with the finishing, the setting, and the final reveal of the quilt. And there you have it, this week's Rolling Stone block, block number 2 of the Ukraine Always Quilt Along, and the quilt diagram that will help you put together the entire quilt. Please join me next week where I'll show you tips and tricks for setting and finishing your quilt. Thank you for watching. See you next week.